She stood over that pot with her hands gripping the counter. Not stirring, not checking, just standing. Because in 45 minutes, her Korean mother-in-law was going to walk through that door. And on the stove, sending a smell through a Seoul apartment that had never once, in all its years, held that particular fragrance, was her grandmother's jollof rice. Her grandmother is gone now. Her grandmother, who never got to meet the family her granddaughter had married into. She hadn't planned this day. Not like this. It started as a normal Sunday. It ended as the day everything changed. And the part that still keeps her up at night, the part she still can't fully explain, is that she almost didn't make the rice at all. But we'll get to that. Because first, you need to understand something about this woman. You need to understand what she was walking into before you can understand what happened when that first bite was taken. Before you can understand why a 78-year-old Korean grandmother, a woman who had cooked every meal in her household for 60 years, a woman who had never once in her life asked anyone outside her bloodline for a recipe, pushed her empty plate forward and said something that sent this woman straight to the bathroom to cry. You need to understand the whole story. And this, right here, is where it begins. Her name is Adiz. Though in Seoul, most people call her Ada. It's easier that way. Fewer confused looks. Fewer polite, uncomfortable silences while someone tries to place the syllables in a mouth that wasn't built for them. She'd learned to accept that. The way you learn to accept a lot of things when you choose to build your life 8,000 miles from where you were born. She had been in Korea for 5 years when this story happened. 5 years of kimchi and Han River walks and learning a language that still, on bad days, felt like trying to hold water in her hands. 5 years of being the only black African woman in most rooms she entered. 5 years of smiling through the stares, the questions, the well-meaning comments that weren't always as well-meaning as the person delivering them believed. And 4 of those 5 years had been spent married to Jae-won. Jae-won, who had first spoken to her in a coffee shop near Hongdae, stumbling through English apologies because he'd taken the last oat milk by accident, and she'd watched the whole thing happen in real time. Jae-won, who had texted her 3 days later with a message that said, simply, "I still feel bad about the milk. Can I make it up to you?" Jae-won, who made her laugh in a way that felt like breathing, like the first breath after being underwater too long. But Jae-won came with a family. And the family, they were a different story entirely. His mother, Seon, was the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She had the quality of absolute stillness. The way a lake looks peaceful right up until you realize there's no bottom. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't cold. She was simply a woman who had very specific ideas about how the world should operate, and who regarded anything outside those ideas with a patience that felt, if you looked too closely, a lot like disapproval wearing good manners. She had been polite to Ada from the beginning. Perfectly, flawlessly polite. And Ada, who had grown up in a home where love was loud and food was the language everyone spoke fluently, had spent 4 years trying to figure out if politeness was ever going to become something warmer. Then there was Jae-won's father, Hyun-sik, a retired engineer who communicated primarily in nods and whose highest form of approval was eating a second helping without being asked. He was easier, not because he was simpler, but because he didn't pretend. What you saw was what you got. Ada respected that more than she ever said out loud. His younger sister, Ji-yeon, was the wild card. 26 years old, obsessed with American pop culture, perpetually on her phone, and inexplicably convinced that all African food was simply very spicy. She had announced this opinion at Ada's second family dinner and had not been corrected because everyone at the table was too polite and Ada was too new to say anything. For years later, Ada was no longer too new. But the opinion has calcified into family lore, and you can't unring a bell. And then there was Halmoni, my grandmother, Jae-won's father's mother, 78 years old, 4'11", the singular most quietly terrifying presence Ada had ever encountered in her life, including her own aunties back home. And that was not a small statement. Halmoni had survived things. You could see it in her face if you looked long enough. The kind of survival that doesn't leave you soft. She had raised 4 children in a Korea that bore almost no resemblance to the one Ada had arrived in. She had made every meal in her home from scratch for 60 years. She had opinions about rice that most people reserve for matters of national security. And she regarded Ada the way you regard a weather forecast. With careful attention. With neither warmth nor hostility. Simply, assessment. Halmoni had not been invited to this particular Sunday. That detail matters. Hold it. It was a Tuesday night when Ada made the decision. She and Jae-won were lying in bed, and she was scrolling through her phone. A voice note from her mother, sent from Lagos. Her mother's voice filling the small Seoul apartment with the particular cadence of an Igbo woman who has decided she has something important to say and intends to say all of it. The voice note was 47 minutes long. Most of it was family news. A cousin's engagement. A neighbor's drama. The price of tomatoes at the market, which had apparently become a topic of personal grievance. But near the end, her mother said something that Ada had to replay 3 times. She said, "You know what, I have not heard from you in a very long time? I have not heard you cook. You used to call me when you were cooking. I would hear the pot. Now I don't hear anything. Ada, are you eating? Are you eating?" It sounds simple, but if you understand what it means in that context, in that accent, coming from a mother who expressed every form of love through the question of whether or not you had eaten, it wasn't simple at all. Ada put her phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had not made jollof rice since she arrived in Korea. Not once. Not real jollof. Her grandmother's recipe, the one written in faded blue ink on a piece of paper her grandmother had folded and pressed into her hand at the airport the day Ada left for Seoul, saying, "Don't let them take your taste from you." She had been taking shortcuts. Korean spices where Nigerian spices should have been. Approximations. Translations. The culinary equivalent of speaking a language you only half know, hoping the other person fills in the gaps. She looked at Jae-won, who had fallen asleep with his arm across her waist. She thought about his family. She thought about the 4 years of careful politeness. She thought about Sunday dinner, a ritual in Jae-won's family, unchanging, sacred in its own secular way, coming up in 5 days. And something shifted. Not a plan exactly, more like a decision made somewhere below the level of rational thought. The kind of decision that already knows it cannot be unmade. She was going to make the rice. The real rice. And she was going to serve it to her husband's family. If you've ever been the person in the room who carries a culture that no one around you can see, if you know what it costs to keep something alive in a place that doesn't know it exists, you already understand exactly why this mattered. This is the kind of story that Afro K-Tales was built for. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Because what happens next is the kind of thing that only gets told once, and you don't want to hear about it from someone else's comment section. Wednesday. She called her mother. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Her mother, who had initially been suspicious. Why now? What happened? Ada, is everything okay with you? And Jae-won eventually understood. The way mothers eventually understand everything, even before you finished explaining. She dictated the recipe from memory, not the written version, the real version, the one that lived in her hands, in the particular way she tilted the pot, in the judgment call of when the tomatoes had bled enough of themselves into the oil. Ada wrote everything down, filling 3 pages of a notebook she normally used for Korean vocabulary. Her mother said, at the end, "Make enough. You always make enough. That is how they know you mean it." Thursday. The hunt. The Mapo district of Seoul has a small cluster of African and South Asian grocery stores that Ada had discovered in her first year, the way immigrants discover the specific coordinates of home in a foreign city, like a compass that doesn't point north so much as it points toward the smell of something familiar. She went there alone on Thursday morning. Palm oil. The right tomatoes. Scotch bonnets. The proper ones, not the mild imposters that appeared sometimes in international sections of regular supermarkets. Bay leaves. The seasoning that had no equivalent translation, that she carried back in her bag like something precious. She stood in that small store for almost 20 minutes, holding things. Not shopping, just holding them. There is a specific kind of emotion that doesn't have a clean English name, and probably exists most fully in the languages of people who have spent time far from where they were born. It is the feeling of holding something from home in a place that doesn't know what home is. It is not sadness exactly. It is not nostalgia exactly. It is something more physical than either of those things. It lives in the hands. It lives in the particular weight of a tin of tomatoes that is the right brand, from the right country, that your mother used, that your grandmother used before her. And here you are, thousands of miles from all of that, and your hands know it before your brain does. Your hands remember. Ada stood there and let her hands remember. The man behind the counter, a Nigerian from Edo State who had been in Korea for 11 years and had, by his own account, made peace with everything except the weather, watched her for a while before he said, "You cooking for Koreans?" She said yes. He studied her face for a second. Then he said, "Family or strangers?" She said, "Family. Almost. It's complicated." He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that contains a full conversation. The kind that says, "I have been exactly where you are standing, in every version of this moment, and I don't need you to explain the complicated part, because I already understand it." He leaned on the counter. He said, "First time cooking for them?" She said yes. He said, "Use enough pepper. Don't reduce it. Don't be afraid of it. They'll respect you more if you don't apologize for the food before they taste it. The moment you start adjusting for their comfort, you stop being yourself, and you start being a version of yourself that you'll have to keep performing. Don't perform. Just cook." She stood with that for a moment. He added, "Also buy 2 extra tins of the tomatoes. You'll want to make enough. You always want to make enough. That's how they know you mean it. When there's too much. When you weren't afraid of running out." She bought the extra tins. She thought about what he said for a long time on the subway home. She replayed it the way you replay advice from a stranger who somehow knew exactly what you needed to hear. Don't perform. Just cook. She had spent 4 years, in various ways, performing, adjusting, translating herself into a more manageable version. A version that didn't take up too much space, didn't ask for too much understanding, didn't bring things to the table that the table wasn't ready for. And she had been so practiced at it that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. The jollof rice was the first time, in a very long while, that she had decided simply not to. Friday, she told J1. She had been waiting for the right moment, and eventually accepted that there was no right moment, and simply told him over dinner, Korean delivery food, the irony not lost on either of them, that she was making jollof rice for Sunday. The look on J1's face passed through approximately 4 distinct phases in under 3 seconds. She had cataloged them later, privately. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been panicked, and then the face he made when he had decided on a position and was about to defend it. He said, "Babe, my mother's already planned the menu." She said, "Then she can add 1 more dish." He said, "Ada." She said, "I'm not asking, J1. I'm telling you what Sunday is going to be." There was a long silence. He set down his chopsticks. He was quiet in the particular way he got quiet when something mattered enough for him to stop performing the act of being unbothered. She watched him think. She had learned to read the geography of his silences. This one was the kind where he was deciding not which position to take, but how to say what he actually felt. He said, "I'm not worried about the food." She said, "I know." He said, "I'm worried about you. I don't want you to put yourself through a whole," he searched for the word, "whole thing, and then have my mother sit there with that face, and then you spend the drive home trying to convince both of us that it's fine." Ada looked at him for a long moment. She said, "J1, I have been fine for 4 years. I've been fine so consistently, at every dinner, at every family event, carrying everything that I carry into those rooms, and coming home and telling you it was fine. I am so tired of fine." She paused. "I'm not doing this because I think it's going to be easy. I'm doing it because it's mine. And I need your family to know that there are things that are mine, and I'm not going to keep them in a drawer because the timing isn't perfect." The apartment was quiet. Then he picked up his chopsticks and went back to eating and said, without looking up, "I'll tell her it's a cultural exchange." She said, "You'll tell her it's dinner." He looked up, held her gaze. Then something in his expression settled, the way something settles when a decision is finally and genuinely made. He said, "Okay, just that. Okay." She didn't sleep well that night. Saturday, she called her grandmother. And then she remembered, the way she remembered every time, the particular weight of remembering. Her grandmother had been gone for 2 years. The phone call she kept starting and stopping in her head was one she could never make. She sat with that for a while, in the kitchen, with the recipe pages in front of her. She read through what she had written. 3 pages of a notebook she normally used for Korean vocabulary, her handwriting getting faster as her mother's instructions came quicker, shorthand for things they both already understood. 3 cups and a little more. Until the color is right. You'll know. That last phrase appeared 4 different times in 3 pages. You'll know. Her grandmother had never believed in precise measurements. She believed in hands that had done this enough times to carry the knowledge without being told. She believed that recipes were not instructions so much as they were memory aids, that a good cook didn't follow a recipe so much as they used it to remember something they already knew. Ada had used this recipe 3 times in her life. Twice with her grandmother standing beside her, correcting the angle of her stirring, adjusting the heat without explanation, adding palm oil from the bottle with the particular wrist tilt of someone who had done this motion 10,000 times. And once, alone, the Christmas after her grandmother died, in her childhood home in Lagos, cooking for her mother and her aunties and her cousins, crying through most of it and telling everyone the steam was getting in her eyes, and everyone pretending to believe her. That was the last time she had made it. Until now. She sat with that for a while, in the kitchen, with the recipe pages in front of her. Then she started cooking the tomato base. Because grief, Ada had learned, doesn't ask permission. But it also doesn't stop your hands. And her grandmother had taught her that a kitchen is not a place for standing still. A kitchen is for moving, for doing, for making something out of what you have, which is the only real answer anyone ever has to anything that has been taken from them. Sunday morning arrived the way important days always do. Quietly, without announcement, as if the day itself hasn't yet decided what it intends to become. Ada was up at 7. J1 was still asleep. She moved through the kitchen in the particular silence of early morning, pulling things from the refrigerator, arranging the counter in the specific geography her mother had taught her. The tomatoes here, the onions there, the Scotch bonnets on the left because they go in last, and you want them close. She put on a playlist she hadn't listened to in months. Old music. Music from the kind of Sunday mornings she grew up in, when the sound of cooking and the sound of music were the same thing, both filling the house before anyone was fully awake. J1 appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:15, wearing the face of a man who has accepted a situation while reserving the right to continue being nervous about it. He poured himself coffee without speaking, leaned against the counter, and watched her work for several minutes. Then he said, "You know my mother is going to have questions." She said, "I know." He said, "She might not." She said, "I know that too." He finished his coffee, watched her a little longer. Then he said the thing she hadn't expected. He said, "It smells like the first time you made this for me. In your apartment. Before we were anything yet." She didn't look up from the pot. She said, "Good. That's what it's supposed to smell like." He nodded once. Went to shower. She kept cooking. By 11, the tomato base had done what a good tomato base is supposed to do. It had reduced and deepened and concentrated until the raw, aggressive brightness of the fresh tomatoes had turned into something older. Something with memory. The palm oil had gone in, and the apartment had shifted. The smell was no longer politely international. It was specific. It was West Africa in a Seoul apartment on a gray Sunday morning. It was her grandmother's kitchen. It was the house she grew up in, the particular geography of Sunday, the sound of her aunties arguing about something in the next room while everyone waited for the food. She stood over the pot and breathed it in and felt, for the first time and longer than she could precisely pinpoint, entirely like herself. The rice went in at noon. And then, at 12:14, J1 walked back into the kitchen holding his phone with an expression she had learned, in 4 years of marriage, to classify as incoming information that he is unsure how to deliver. She said, "What?" He said, "So. My grandmother called my dad this morning." She said, "Okay." He said, "And my dad mentioned Sunday dinner." She said, "J1." He said, "And now she's coming." The kitchen went quiet except for the sound of the rice beginning to absorb the broth. Ada turned from the pot and looked at her husband for a long time. Then she turned back to the pot. She said, "How many is that now?" He counted on his fingers. "My parents. Jiun. My uncle and his wife. And now Helmoni. 6 people. 6 people who had never eaten jollof rice. One of whom had been cooking Korean food since before Ada's parents were born. One of whom had already, at a previous dinner, quietly watched Ada arrange a Nigerian pepper soup and said something to J1's father in a low voice that J1 had refused to translate. Ada reached for the pot lid. "I checked the rice. Put the lid back," she said, quietly, to no one in particular or possibly to her grandmother who was not there. "Okay, then we make enough." This is the moment in the story where most people would have changed the plan. Reduced the pepper. Made a backup dish. Done something to protect themselves from the verdict. Ada didn't. And the reason tells you everything about who she is and what this meal actually meant. Stay with this story. If you're not subscribed to Afro K Tales yet, do it now, because what walks through that door in the next few minutes is the part that changed everything. They arrived at 4 o'clock. Jaewon's mother came first, as she always did, as if arrival time were itself a form of communication. She stepped through the door in a gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks, and paused in the hallway the way she always paused. That single still moment of orientation, taking in the space, cataloging. Her eyes moved to the kitchen. Her nostrils moved, almost imperceptibly. Something passed across her face. She said, "Something smells different today." Ada said, "I cooked." A beat. Soohyun said, "You cook Korean food now." Ada said, "I cooked Nigerian food. My grandmother's recipe." Another beat. Longer this time. The particular length of a beat that is not silence, but is a sentence being rephrased before delivery. Soohyun said, "Ah," and smiled. The smile was impenetrable. Ada had spent 4 years studying it, and still could not read it with certainty.
Jaewon's father arrived next, nodded at Ada, moved to the living room, located the remote control. His relationship with Sunday was uncomplicated, and he saw no reason to complicate it. Jihyun came in mid-sentence on a phone call, waved at Ada without making eye contact, and then actually stopped walking. She lowered her phone from her ear. She looked at the kitchen. She said, to whoever she was speaking to, "I'll call you back." She hung up. She said to Ada, What is that smell? That's not Korean food." Ada said, "No, it's not." Jihyun said, "Is it spicy?" Ada said, "Yes." Jihyun said, "How spicy?" Ada smiled. Jihyun's eyes widened very slightly. The uncle and his wife arrived and did the polite rounds of greeting, and the wife, who had always been kinder to Ada than the rest of them, touched Ada's arm and leaned in and said quietly, "It smells wonderful in here. What did you make?" And something in Ada's chest loosened, just slightly, like a knot with one strand pulled free. And then, the door opened again, and Halmoni came in. She was small in the way that genuinely powerful things are often small. She moved through the door with the particular economy of a person who has never in their life wasted emotion. She was wearing a hanbok, the traditional Korean dress, which meant she had made a decision about this Sunday specifically. She wore it like a statement. She looked around the apartment with eyes that had seen enough of life to skip the surface of things and go directly to what lay underneath. And then she smelled it. She stopped. Not the polite pause of Soohyun. A full stop. Her head came up. Her chin tilted, the way an animal does when it catches something on the wind and needs a moment to classify it. She turned her head toward the kitchen. She looked at Ada. Ada looked back at her. Halmoni said something in Korean. Low. Short. She said it to Jaewon's father, who was already on the sofa with the remote, and he responded without looking up. Jaewon appeared at Ada's elbow, and she said, through her teeth, but without moving her mouth, "What did she say?" He said, quietly, "She asked if you made the food." Ada said, "And what did your father say?" Jaewon paused in a way that lasted precisely 1 second too long. Ada said, "Jaewon. He said yes, but that it might be experimental." Ada turned to look at her husband. He had the expression of a man who is deciding whether to run. She said, very quietly, "Your father has never in his life tasted anything I have cooked." He said, "I know." She said, "Where did he get the experiment from?" There was a short silence. He said, "I may have used that word when I was warning them." Ada looked at her husband for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Halmoni, who was still watching her from across the room with those dark, assessing eyes. Then she looked back at the kitchen, where the jollof rice was doing what good jollof rice does in its final stage, developing the bottom layer, that particular crust that her grandmother called the blessing of patience. She said, "Set the table." And she went back to the kitchen. The table was set. The food was brought out in the order her mother had taught her. The jollof rice first, the pot itself, placed at the center, not scooped into a serving bowl because Ada's grandmother had always said that the pot was part of the presentation, and anyone who didn't understand that had never been truly hungry. Fried plantain in the yellow-orange of things that have been done exactly right. A pepper sauce on the side for those who wanted it, though Ada noted privately that the rice itself already had enough pepper for this to be largely ceremonial. And a small bowl of fried chicken, not Korean fried chicken, Not the light and delicate double fry of a Seoul Jamaican restaurant, but Nigerian fried chicken, darker and denser, and coated with the kind of seasoning that announces itself. The family arranged themselves around the table. There was a moment, not long, not dramatic, but unmistakable, where everyone looked at the food before anyone moved. Ada stood. She did not sit. Not yet. Old habit, from her family's Sunday table. You stood until everyone had served themselves. You watched. You waited. The food was part of the hospitality, and the hospitality was not complete until the food was in front of the people who needed it. Soo-yeon served herself first. A careful, moderate portion. Her face gave nothing. The uncle's wife served herself with what looked like genuine enthusiasm, and Ada felt the knot in her chest loosen another strand. Ji-yeon poked at the rice with her spoon, then, apparently deciding that investigation was less efficient than experience, served herself a full portion and then said, "Does it have much pepper?" And then ate a spoonful before anyone could answer, and then reached immediately for her water glass, without looking at anyone. Ada said, "Ji-yeon, breathe through your nose." Ji-yeon breathed through her nose. Her eyes watered slightly. She took another bite. Jaewon's father loaded his plate with the particular focus of a man who has decided that whatever is happening is less important than whether the food is good. He took his first bite. He chewed. He reached for the chicken without pausing. Ada took that as a good sign. Jaewon served himself and caught Ada's eye and smiled, and she looked away before she could let the emotion in it reach her face, because she was not going to cry at this table. Not at this part of the story. Halmoni had not yet touched her food. She was looking at the pot. Not her plate. The pot. She leaned forward slightly, this small, powerful woman in her hanbok, and she looked at the pot the way a craftsperson looks at another craftsperson's work. Not casually, not socially, but technically, searching for the method in it. Then she picked up her spoon and served herself. A small portion. Precise. She was not committing. She was sampling. Ada sat down. The table was eating. Sounds, that particular soundscape of people taking food seriously. No one was talking. In Ada's family, that was the highest compliment, the silence of genuine attention. She didn't know if it translated here. She watched faces. She cataloged. Ji-yeon was her second helping. She had stopped reaching for the water glass. The plantain had arrived in front of her, and she was eating it with an expression of someone having a private revelation and not yet ready to share it publicly. Jaewon's father had finished his first plate and had, without a word, served himself a second. Ada watched this happen. She had been told about this man's second plate policy. She looked at Jaewon. Jaewon gave her a tiny, barely perceptible nod. The uncle's wife leaned across the table and said, in careful English, "What is the spice?" "The main spice? I want to know the name." Ada told her. She pulled out her phone and typed it in. Soo-yeon was halfway through her plate, eating steadily, neither fast nor slow. Her face, still. A closed door. A locked window. Ada watched her the way you watch the sky when you can't tell if the storm is coming or passing. And then, at some point, Ada couldn't have said exactly when, time was moving strangely, she became aware that Halmoni had finished her rice. Finished. The small, precise portion she had served herself. Gone. Ada noticed. Jaewon noticed. A look passed between them. Halmoni sat with her empty plate for a moment. Then she reached out and served herself again. A full portion this time. Ada felt something move through her that didn't have a precise name. Something between triumph and grief and homecoming and grief again. She took a breath and looked at the table. All these people, eating her grandmother's food in a Seoul apartment while it rained outside. And she thought, she's here. Somehow, impossibly, she's at this table. She was thinking this when she noticed Soo-yeon put down her chopsticks. The table, without fully knowing why, went quiet. Soo-yeon had put down her chopsticks and placed her hands flat on the table, the way you do when you have arrived at a conclusion. She looked at Ada. Not the polite look. A different look. Beneath the surface of it, something Ada hadn't seen before. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. 5. The table waited. 6. 7. 8. Ada did not look away. 9. 10. Soo-yeon picked her chopsticks back up. She served herself more rice. Ada heard Ji-yeon exhale next to her. She heard Jaewon's hand find hers under the table. Right here. This exact moment. If this story is landing somewhere in your chest, subscribe to Afro K-Tales. This is what this channel is for. Real stories, real crossings, real moments where two worlds sit at the same table and have to decide, without words, whether they'll make room for each other. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.
The dinner continued. Plates were emptied. The pot was visited more than once. At some point, Ji-yeon and the uncle's wife started asking Ada questions. Not polite questions, but real ones, the kind with follow-ups, the kind that meant they wanted to actually understand. What region of Nigeria? What the rice is called specifically? Is it always made with palm oil? Can you make it without meat? What do you eat it with at celebrations? Ada answered all of it. Jae-won translated the parts his grandmother needed, and Halmoni listened to the translations with an attention that felt, for the first time, like something other than assessment. At some point, Ada got up to bring more plantain from the kitchen, and when she came back, Halmoni was talking. Not to anyone at the table specifically, just talking, in the low, even voice she used when she was saying something that mattered. Jae-won was listening, his head slightly bowed, the posture he had when he was concentrating hard on getting every word right. Ada set the plantain down and stood and waited. Halmoni finished speaking. There was a moment of silence. Then everyone at the table was looking at Ada. She said, "What did she say?" Jae-won looked at his grandmother, then back at Ada. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He took a breath. Ada said, steadier than she felt, "Jae-won, tell me." And he told her. And Ada walked to the bathroom and closed the door and stood over the sink for 5 minutes. She didn't cry immediately. That surprised her. She'd expected the tears to be immediate. They weren't. She stood there for a moment, just holding the edge of the sink, looking at herself in the mirror, and the feeling she was trying to contain was too large and too complex for a single classification. It was not sadness. It was not even purely joy. It was something older. The specific feeling of having carried something a very long way and finally being able to set it down. She thought about the airport. The day she left Lagos the first time, 6 years ago. Not for Korea, for the UK first, where she had studied, where she had begun the slow process of becoming someone who existed between places. She thought about her grandmother pressing that folded paper into her hand and saying, "Don't let them take your taste from you." She hadn't understood fully, then, what that meant. She thought it was about food, about not eating only foreign things, about remembering to cook for yourself. She understood now that it was about something much larger than food. Your taste is your identity. Your taste is the specific, irreducible version of yourself that was built in a particular place, by particular people, through particular experiences, and that no amount of adaptation, no amount of translation, no amount of politely adjusting for the room can touch, if you refuse to let it be touched. Your taste is the thing that is still entirely yours even when everything around you is foreign. And the warning, "Don't let them take it," wasn't about cultural purity or resistance to change. It was about this. About not disappearing. About making sure that when you finally set the pot down in front of people who didn't know you, they would taste something real. Not a performance. Not a translation. You. She thought about her grandmother. About the folded piece of paper at the airport. Don't let them take your taste from you. About the voice notes from her mother. Are you eating? About 5 years of being the only one in the room who carried this particular weight. She thought about the man at the African grocery store. Don't apologize for the food before they taste it. She thought about Halmoni, 78 years old, 60 years of cooking for her family. The most intimidating presence at any table Ada had ever shared, pushing her plate forward and saying what she said. She ran in cold water, pressed it to her face, looked at herself again. She thought, my grandmother never got to meet these people, never got to sit at this table, never got to see that her recipe, written in fading blue ink on a folded piece of paper, had traveled 8,000 miles and sat down in a Seoul apartment on a rainy Sunday and fed a Korean family who had never once tasted anything like it. But in some way that Ada couldn't fully articulate and didn't need to, she had been there. The food was the bridge. The food had always been the bridge. Her grandmother had known it when she pressed that paper into her hand. You think it's a recipe? It's not. It's a letter. It's an introduction. It's the thing you give to a room that doesn't know you yet, so that when they taste it, they understand something about you that words couldn't carry. They understand where you come from. They understand who made you. They understand, in the most direct and unmediated way possible, that you were loved, specifically, particularly, with the kind of love that gets written down and passed forward because it is too important to leave to memory alone. Ada dried her face. She unlocked the bathroom door. She walked back to the table. Jaewon's mother was the first to look up when she came back. That same face, careful, measured, the years of practiced inscrutability. But Ada, who had sat across from this woman at 100 dinners, who had spent 4 years learning to read the margins of her expression, saw something in it. Something that hadn't been there before. Soo-yeon said, "Are you all right?" Ada said, "Yes." Soo-yeon said, "The food was very good." Ada said, "Thank you." A pause. Soo-yeon said, "My mother-in-law does not give compliments about cooking." Ada said, "I know." Soo-yeon said, "She gave you one." Ada said, "I know." Another pause. Then Soo-yeon said, as if the words had been waiting for the right moment of structural integrity in a long-constructed wall, "You must miss your grandmother." Ada stood very still. She said, "Every day." Soo-yeon nodded once. Just once. But it was a different kind of nod. Not the polite nod. The kind of nod that means, "I understand." The kind that takes years to earn. Jaewon was watching from across the table. Ada didn't look at him. If she looked at him, she would lose the composure she had just spent 5 minutes in the bathroom reconstructing. The uncle's wife said, "You have to teach me this recipe." Ji-yeon said, from behind her third serving of plantain, "I thought African food was just spicy rice." "I'm so sorry I thought that." The uncle said something to Jaewon that Jaewon translated with a grin. "He says you cook better than my father does." My father has officially not responded to this. Jaewon's father, from behind his third plate, produced a single grunt that communicated, somehow, exactly everything. And Halmoni. Ada looked at Halmoni, who was sitting with the stillness of someone completely at rest for a moment. She was not looking at Ada. She was looking at the pot, the now empty pot, in the middle of the table. She said something short and quiet and nobody translated it, but Jaewon smiled, and Ada decided she didn't need the translation. Some things don't need to be translated. You feel them, or you miss them. There's no middle register. They left at 8. One by one, coats and shoes, and the particular choreography of Korean goodbyes, which have their own specific length and sequence that Ada had come to know. The uncle and his wife first. Ji-yeon, who hugged Ada, an actual hug, both arms, something she had never done before, and said, "Same time next month? You cook, I bring wine." And Ada said yes. Jaewon's father paused at the door and turned and looked at Ada and said one word in Korean. Jaewon, beside her, said quietly, "It means well done." Like, specifically for a craftsperson. Not general compliments. Specifically for something made well. Ada said, "Thank you." He nodded. Went through the door. Soo-yeon paused in the hallway. She was putting on her coat, and she paused, and she looked at Ada, and she said, "Next Sunday, come to our house. I'll cook." And then, before Ada could respond, "I'll teach you something. If you'll teach me something in return." Ada said, "What do you want to learn?" Soo-yeon said, "How to make the rice." And then she left. And then there was only Halmoni, small and still in her hanbok, standing in Ada's doorway. She looked at Ada for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Ada's hand. Both hands, actually, her small, strong hands around Ada's, holding them the way you hold something you're assessing the weight of. She looked down at their hands together and then up at Ada's face. And she spoke. Jaewon was 2 meters away and Ada looked at him, and he was perfectly still, listening. And when Halmoni finished, he didn't speak immediately, and the silence lasted long enough that Ada said, "Jaewon." And he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between tenderness and awe, and she said, "The food remembers where it comes from." She said, "A woman who cooks like that was taught by someone who loved her very much." Ada could not speak. Halmoni patted her hands once, twice, with the brisk practicality of a woman who has made her point and sees no need to belabor it. Then she released them. She turned to go. At the threshold, she stopped. Without turning around, she said something else. Short. 1 sentence. Jaewon said, "She wants to know if your grandmother had other recipes." Ada pressed her lips together. She said, when she could, "Yes. Many." Halmoni nodded, once, to the hallway. And then she was gone. Ada and Jaewon stood in their apartment in the silence of a room that has had a lot of people in it and is now, suddenly, just itself again. The table needed clearing. The pot needed washing. The residue of the day was everywhere, in the best possible way. The plates, the glasses, the chair Ji-yeon had pulled at an angle that nobody had corrected because she was too busy eating to be bothered with furniture. Jo-won stood behind Ada and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I used the word experimental." She said, "You did." He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "You're going to need to be more sorry than that." He said, "How much more sorry?" She considered it. She said, "You're washing the pot." He said, "That's fair." She said, "And you're calling my mother to tell her what happened." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your mother's voice notes are 47 minutes long." She said, "I know." He held her a little tighter. He said, "Ada, you know what Halmoni said about the food remembering where it comes from?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I think she was also talking about you." She didn't respond to that. Because there are things that are true and that you know are true and that you have no good response to. And the only honest thing you can do is stand in the kitchen of your Seoul apartment and let them be true. The pot was empty. Her grandmother's recipe had made it 8,000 miles. And the table, for the first time in 4 years, had felt like home. Here is the thing about that day that Ada still thinks about. It wasn't the compliments. It wasn't Halmoni asking for the recipe, or Soo-yeon offering to teach her in return, or Jae-won's father eating 3 plates without apology, or Ji-yeon discovering that she had been wrong about African food for 4 years with the particular shock of someone who realizes they've been missing something rather than just encountering something new. It was the pot, the empty pot in the center of the table. Her grandmother had a saying. She had many sayings. She was a woman who had lived long enough and lost enough to have compressed a great deal of life into the fewest possible words. But this one stayed with Ada. She had said, "An empty pot is a full room. You can't have both. When they take from you, they give you something back. The pot empties. The room fills. That is the agreement." Ada had cooked that rice carrying an enormous weight. The weight of 4 years of wondering whether she would ever belong at that table. The weight of carrying a culture alone in a country that didn't know it. The weight of a grandmother she couldn't call anymore, whose recipe she had been afraid to make because making it fully felt like admitting how much she missed her. And in the emptying of the pot, some of that weight had lifted. Not all of it. Loss doesn't work that way. You don't cook one meal and become whole. You don't cross one table and bridge every distance. Life is not a drama series where resolution arrives cleanly in the final act. But something had happened. Something real. Something witnessed. Something that 6 people sitting around a table had participated in, whether or not they'd fully understood what they were part of. A grandmother who couldn't be there had been there. A family who didn't know her yet had tasted her. An empty pot. A full room. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know why Afro K-Tales exist. This channel is for the crossings. For the tables where 2 worlds sit down and decide, over a shared meal, who they're going to be to each other. For the grandmothers who aren't here anymore, but whose hands are still in the food. For the women carrying cultures in foreign cities, refusing to let the distance hollow them out. Subscribe to Afro K-Tales right now if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because next week, Ada is going to Soo-yeon's kitchen, and Soo-yeon is going to teach her how to make kimchi. From scratch. With Halmoni watching. Let that sit for a second. The woman who asked for my grandmother's recipe. Sitting in the grandmother's kitchen. Being taught by the family she spent 4 years trying to reach. You don't want to miss that. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about not giving up on the table. Afro K-Tales. Every crossing matters. Every story is worth telling. We'll see you next week.